What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. It's Ryan, former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and I've flown airliners for years on top of that. And today we're doing a full deep dive on the Strait of Hormuz, because there's a lot of momentum right now toward the idea that the U.S. military campaign there is finally turning the corner. But I want to walk you through exactly what's actually been confirmed, what the real picture looks like as of today, the full history of how we even got here, and where I think the honest line is between real progress and premature victory laps, because I've seen some pretty aggressive framing on this floating around, and I want to give you the complete, grounded story. Grab a coffee, this one's going to be thorough. So first, let's set the stage properly, because if you haven't been following this specific thread of the broader Iran war closely, the Strait of Hormuz piece of this deserves its own full explanation before we get into the current state of play. Back on February 28th, the U.S. and Israel launched the strikes that started this entire war, hitting Iranian military and government targets across the country and killing Iran's supreme leader in the process, which was about as dramatic and consequential an opening move as you could have for a conflict like this. Iran's response, in addition to missile and drone attacks against Israel and against American positions in the region, was to close the Strait of Hormuz to foreign shipping almost immediately, within essentially the first day or two of the war starting. The IRGC put out warnings over VHF radio telling vessels flat out that no ship is allowed to pass the Strait of Hormuz. And by early March, specifically March 2nd, they'd formalized that position, announcing the strait was closed to what they called unfriendly nations, with only Iran-approved vessels permitted through going forward. The British Royal Navy at the time noted that this closure wasn't legally binding under international law, but they also acknowledged that safety simply couldn't be guaranteed for vessels attempting passage, which led a lot of shipping companies to either stay in port entirely or turn their vessels back rather than risk it. Now, if you're not familiar with why this specific waterway matters so much on a global scale, I want to be really clear about the numbers here, because it's honestly hard to overstate just how significant this choke point is to the entire world economy. Before this war started, roughly a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and about a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas passed through that strait on a regular basis. Geographically, it sits right at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, with Iran positioned along its northern side and Oman along its southern side. And critically, there's no real alternate shipping route that comes anywhere close to replacing that volume of traffic. There are some limited pipeline workarounds in the region, but nothing that can substitute for the strait itself at anywhere near that scale. So when Iran closed it, this wasn't some kind of regional inconvenience limited to countries in the immediate area. This immediately became a genuinely global economic story. Shipping firms suspended operations almost overnight. Energy markets reacted with real volatility. And the pressure to reopen that waterway became one of the defining strategic objectives of this entire war, arguably standing right alongside the war's original core military objectives against Iran's leadership and nuclear program. So the U.S. military response to all of this was to launch what's turned into an extended multi-month campaign specifically aimed at reopening the strait by force if necessary, starting with a dedicated round of airstrikes on Iranian targets directly along the waterway back on March 19th. This campaign has been conducted jointly by the United States Air Force, the United States Navy, and the Israeli Air Force working together, and it's had some genuinely significant and intense moments throughout its run. In one particularly notable stretch, around what was described as the 12th day of the broader conflict in mid-March, the Pentagon reported that American forces destroyed 16 Iranian boats that were believed to be actively laying naval mines directly in the strait, after intelligence had indicated Iran had started deploying these explosive devices, specifically in an attempt to physically block the waterway outright, which would represent an escalation beyond just threatening or attacking individual ships. That particular operation was described at the time by defense officials as one of the most intense single days of strikes since the war had begun, with operations in that same window also targeting Iranian ballistic missile infrastructure and drone production facilities in parallel, suggesting a coordinated push to degrade multiple Iranian capabilities simultaneously rather than treating the strait as an isolated problem separate from the rest of the war. And even in the face of that kind of sustained pressure, the IRGC's response was to double down rather than back off, declaring publicly that any vessel belonging to the United States, Israel, or any allied nation passing through the strait would from that point forward be considered what they explicitly called a legitimate target. That kind of statement tells you how far from settled this situation actually was, even after a pretty aggressive and successful round of U.S. strikes against their mine-laying operations specifically. This wasn't a case of one decisive engagement ending the standoff. It was one chapter in what's turned into a much longer-running contest for control. Then on April 13th, the U.S. escalated the pressure campaign even further and imposed a full naval blockade on Iran itself, which is actually a separate and honestly quite significant operation distinct from the ongoing airstrike campaign. This is the U.S. Navy and Air Force actively working to intercept and block vessels from entering or leaving Iranian ports entirely, essentially flipping the exact same pressure tool back onto Iran that Iran had originally tried to use against the rest of the world when they first closed the strait. And the numbers behind this blockade operation are genuinely striking when you look at them closely. As of the most recent tracking available, U.S. Central Command reports having intercepted 85 separate vessels as part of this ongoing blockade effort, with 3 ships seized outright by U.S. forces. Lloyd's List, which for those who don't follow maritime shipping is one of the most respected and longest-running independent shipping industry trackers in the entire world, has separately reported that 26 vessels have managed to successfully bypass the blockade despite all of this sustained U.S. naval presence, which tells you the blockade, while clearly substantial, hasn't been airtight either. And the U.S. government has stated publicly that this blockade is costing Iran somewhere in the range of $500 million a day, which, if that figure is accurate, represents an absolutely enormous sustained economic hit. That's the kind of daily financial pressure that genuinely starts to strain a national economy over time in a way that individual military strikes, however intense, sometimes struggle to replicate on their own. Iran, for its part, didn't just absorb that pressure passively, they retaliated by seizing 2 cargo ships of their own, which tells you this has become a genuine tit-for-tat maritime standoff, rather than a one-sided campaign. Now here's where I want to walk through the back and forth, up and down nature of the claimed progress on this specific issue over the past several months, because there's been a real and documented pattern of premature declarations of victory here that I think is genuinely important to be honest about before evaluating any brand new headline on the topic. Back on March 9th, quite early in this whole saga, President Trump said, and I'm working from the direct quote here, "The war is very complete," pretty much. And he went on to claim that the Iranian military had been effectively destroyed, and that the Strait of Hormuz had already reopened at that point, while also separately expressing genuine interest in the idea of the U.S. actually seizing control of the waterway from Iran outright going forward. Then, roughly a month later in early April, following the ceasefire that Pakistan helped broker between the two sides, the U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth stated publicly and directly that the Strait of Hormuz was set to reopen for commercial shipping, saying he believed the ceasefire itself would hold, and specifically reinforcing that commerce would now flow through the waterway unhindered, describing this as a necessary window for further diplomatic developments to follow. So you've actually had at least 2 entirely separate points earlier this year, one from the President himself and one from the Secretary of War, or Senior U.S. officials declared this specific problem essentially solved and behind us, and neither of those declarations ended up actually holding up over the following weeks, with disruption, fighting, and blockade activity continuing well past each of those supposed resolution points. So now let's get into where things actually stand as of right now, today, because this is where I really want to be careful and precise, because I think the honest and complete picture here is considerably more complicated than a clean, simple U.S. military just broke Iran's grip on Hormuz headline would lead you to believe. As of the most recent reporting available, drafts of a potential agreement between the U.S. and Iran are reportedly being actively circulated between the parties and are described by Qatari officials, who are serving as a key mediator on this specific diplomatic track, as being in what they called very progressive stages of development. But in that exact same breath, Qatar's own foreign ministry has been careful and clear to emphasize that this particular effort is being pursued specifically as a short-term diplomatic solution, rather than some kind of comprehensive final settlement, and that there's currently nothing formally on the books yet in terms of actual direct talks being scheduled between the two governments. And even more importantly than the diplomatic ambiguity, tensions in the strait itself are reportedly continuing to grow right now, rather than settling down or de-escalating, which is a pretty significant detail that cuts directly against any narrative of a clean resolution. A senior Iranian military official, Mohsen Rezai, who serves specifically as a military advisor to Iran's supreme leader, meaning this is someone speaking with real authority within the regime's inner circle, said on Iranian state television just in the past couple of days that Tehran will not stand idly by and allow the United States to continue its naval blockade of Iranian exports and vessels, and he stated explicitly that Iran will not allow any shipments whatsoever to pass through the strait other than along Iran's own specifically stipulated route. That's about as direct and unambiguous a statement of continued defiance as you're going to get from a senior regime official, and it was made this week, not months ago, during some earlier and now outdated phase of the conflict. So when you put all of these pieces together into one complete picture, what you actually have right now is not a clean, decisive U.S. military victory that definitively broke Iran's grip on the strait once and for all. What you genuinely have is an extremely costly, sustained military and economic pressure campaign combining the naval blockade, the ongoing airstrikes, and the earlier mine-clearing operations. That has meaningfully degraded Iran's practical ability to control that waterway, and has been costing them real, substantial money every single day, according to U.S. figures. That's layered directly on top of ongoing diplomatic efforts that are being described by mediators as promising and progressive, but still explicitly incomplete and not yet formalized into actual scheduled talks. And that's further layered on top of continued, explicit, on-the-record threats from senior Iranian officials just this week that they will keep actively contesting control of that strait regardless of the blockade's economic toll on them. That combination adds up to a meaningfully different picture than the phrase grip broken would suggest. What you're actually looking at is a picture of a still genuinely and actively contested waterway, one where the U.S. clearly holds significant military and economic leverage that shouldn't be dismissed or understated, but also one where Iran has repeatedly and consistently shown, going back to those earlier premature declarations from both Trump in March and Hegseth in April, that they're not simply going to fold or fully back down just because Washington announces from a podium that the problem has been solved. I also want to bring in a piece I came across just today from a group of experienced former military officials writing in the Washington Times, because I think it genuinely captures the current honest, sober assessment of this situation better than most of the more sensationalized coverage that's out there right now. Writing under the direct headline that the U.S. must reopen the Strait of Hormuz, they're framing throughout the piece is important and worth walking through. They state plainly that although both sides currently appear to be in some kind of de-escalation phase, Iran itself still claims that nothing has actually changed about the practical status of the strait, meaning Iran isn't conceding anything through its own public statements, even as broader tensions seem to be cooling slightly elsewhere. Their core argument is that the U.S. military genuinely does have the capability to restore full freedom of navigation through that waterway, that this isn't beyond America's actual military capacity, but that actually accomplishing it is going to require real, sustained determination and patience, rather than a single decisive strike or announcement. And they lay out a specific three-part approach for how they believe this should actually be done going forward. First, opening an actively protected corridor through the strait so that commercial shipping traffic can realistically start moving again right now under military escort. Second, working to cut off Iran's overland supply routes, specifically in order to reduce their overall capacity to sustain this prolonged standoff indefinitely. And third, clearly and consistently signaling a genuine willingness to re-escalate militarily without hesitation if Iran resumes directly targeting commercial ships again. I think the fact that experienced, credible former military and defense officials are actively writing and publishing this kind of piece, as of just this week, tells you something pretty important on its own. If this were genuinely already a fully solved problem, you simply wouldn't be seeing serious, informed voices from within defense and national security circles, laying out in detail exactly what they believe still needs to happen in order to actually finish the job properly. I want to spend a little more time here talking about what a genuinely protected shipping corridor through a contested strait actually looks like in practice, because I think that's useful context for understanding just how difficult full freedom of navigation is to actually restore once the initial disruption has already happened. This isn't a simple matter of just announcing the waterway is open again and expecting commercial shipping to instantly resume at pre-war levels. Insurance underwriters for commercial shipping have to reassess their risk models for the entire region, and that process alone can take considerably longer than the underlying military situation might suggest, because insurers are understandably conservative and tend to wait for a sustained track record of safety before meaningfully lowering premiums or removing exclusion zones from their coverage. Shipping companies themselves have to rebuild confidence among their own crews, who are the ones actually putting themselves at risk transiting through a strait where mines have been laid and vessels have already been damaged or captured. And, from a purely military standpoint, actually escorting commercial traffic safely through a narrow, contested strait requires a sustained, resource-intensive naval presence positioned continuously along the transit route, which ties down significant naval assets for as long as that escort mission continues, assets that would otherwise be available for other tasks. So even in a genuinely best-case scenario where the military threat has been substantially reduced, you're still looking at a gradual, staged process of shipping traffic actually returning to anything resembling normal levels, not some kind of instant flip back to pre-war conditions, the moment a ceasefire or a blockade success gets announced. Let me also touch on the human cost here for a moment, because I think it's genuinely important not to lose sight of that amid all of this strategic, economic, and military analysis. Since this crisis began back in late February, there's been at least one tugboat sunk in the strait, at least 17 merchant ships damaged in various incidents, with a meaningful number of those reportedly abandoned entirely by their crews, rather than repaired and returned to service, 2 merchant ships captured outright by Iranian forces, 12 seafarers killed or reported missing throughout this crisis, and a port worker killed with 2 more wounded in a related attack in Bahrain. Those are real people working ordinary jobs in the global maritime shipping industry who've paid a genuine and serious price for this broader geopolitical conflict. And I think that's worth acknowledging clearly and directly before getting too deep into pure hardware and strategy talk, because it's easy for that human element to get lost in a story that's mostly discussed in terms of barrels of oil and daily dollar costs to Iran's economy. I also want to touch briefly on the broader economic ripple effects of this entire crisis beyond just the direct shipping numbers, because I think it helps explain why there's so much pressure from multiple different directions to actually get this fully resolved rather than just managed indefinitely. Energy markets globally have had to absorb repeated shocks throughout this crisis, as traffic through the strait has fluctuated dramatically depending on the intensity of fighting in any given week. Countries that depend heavily on oil imports transiting through that specific route have faced real supply uncertainty, which shows up eventually in fuel prices for ordinary consumers in countries that may have absolutely nothing directly to do with this conflict. And there's a broader signal being sent to markets and to other potential adversaries around the world about whether a determined regional actor can successfully disrupt one of the most critical choke points in global trade for an extended period, which is exactly the kind of precedent that the former officials writing in the Washington Times piece seem genuinely worried about when they talk about failure emboldening America's adversaries worldwide, not just in this specific region. So let me give you my honest, complete take here as someone who understands military operations and has spent real time thinking through how sustained campaigns like this one actually unfold over months rather than days. I think what the U.S. military has genuinely accomplished so far in this specific fight over the Strait is significant and shouldn't be understated or dismissed, successfully destroying an active mine-laying operation, sustaining an 85-vessel interception blockade over an extended period, and imposing what appears to be a real and substantial daily economic cost on Iran's government that adds up to serious, sustained military and economic pressure, and it represents a genuine application of American naval and air power toward a specific strategic objective. But I also think the honest, complete read on where things actually stand right now, today, is that this remains an active, contested, and fundamentally unresolved situation rather than a finished and settled one. We've already seen this exact story declared solved not once, but twice earlier this year. Once from the president directly in early March, and once from the Secretary of War in early April. And both times, those confident declarations turned out to be premature, with fighting, blockade activity, and shipping disruption, continuing well past the point where senior officials had publicly said the strait was reopening for good. Given that specific documented track record of premature declarations, I think the responsible and honest thing to do with any brand new headline claiming the U.S. military just broke Iran's grip on Hormuz is to treat it with that same kind of healthy, informed skepticism, rather than immediately accepting it at face value. Instead of taking any single announcement as the final word, I'd encourage watching for a few specific concrete things going forward, whether actual commercial shipping volume through the strait genuinely recovers in a sustained way over multiple consecutive weeks, rather than just a brief uptick, whether insurance rates and risk assessments for the region actually start coming down in a meaningful way, which would reflect real confidence from the people whose job it is to price risk professionally, and whether Iran's own senior officials stop making statements like the one we just heard this week about not standing idly by. That kind of concrete, verifiable, sustained evidence is what would actually tell you the situation is genuinely resolved, rather than just another confident-sounding announcement layered on top of the 2 we've already seen fail to hold up earlier this year. I'll be tracking this closely over the coming days and weeks, and I'll absolutely do a follow-up video as soon as we see whether that circulating draft agreement between the U.S. and Iran actually turns into something concrete and formalized, or whether this ends up becoming yet another chapter in what's already been a pretty long-running and well-documented pattern of premature victory declarations, specifically on this Strait of Hormuz issue. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. Do you think the U.S. has genuinely and finally turned the corner on the strait this time around? Or do you think we're looking at another temporary lull before this situation flares back up again, the way it already has multiple times this year? I'd genuinely love to hear where you guys land on this one. And if you want more breakdowns like this, where I try to carefully separate the actual confirmed, documented facts from the more dramatic headline framing that tends to circulate around stories like this, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps me keep putting this kind of content out for you guys. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, signing off.